On September the 18th, 2024, one of my closest friends collapsed and died suddenly whilst at home with his teenage daughter. He was a great fan of this podcast, and the last time I saw him, he was trying to answer some questions from our regular quiz episodes. Not very successfully, I have to say. This episode is dedicated to his memory. Anthony Martin, 1968 to 2024. We'll miss you. Hello, I'm Oliver Colling, and this is my 70s TV childhood. Hello, welcome back to my 70s TV childhood. We are a podcast dedicated to remembering what it was like to grow up in 1970s Britain and the central role that television played in our lives. Television was still reasonably new, and it provided an exciting window onto another world for many of us, which provided a stark contrast to life in the 70s, which was a bit more limited in most respects, not least the tough times our parents experienced as Britain came to the end of its industrial primacy. But actually, I might be overplaying that. For me, and I suspect for many of you listening, the 70s represented a happy time, as it was our childhood. And whenever you were born, those early years are full of happy memories of play, of going to school, and of starting to grow up. Thanks to all of you who've been in touch via our blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com or via our Facebook, Twitter /X, YouTube or LinkedIn sites. It's always great to hear from listeners, and I have to say, you aren't shy in sharing your thoughts with us. Our recent episode featuring ITV lunchtime favourite Rainbow created quite a stir on social media, with many of you saying what happy memories the episode brought back to you. There were countless lovely comments, but here's one from Paul on our Facebook page, which pretty much sums up the feelings of many of you. As soon as I hear the theme tune, I am transported back to being 6 or 7, sitting on the living room floor playing with my toy cars whilst Mum was cooking the mince for dinner. Amazing what memories a single song does for you. But to be honest, I feel the same about Robinson Crusoe, The Flashing Blade, White Horses, and so on. Well, thank you, Paul. We are so glad to be able to bring back such happy memories. We've also recently been recognised in the podcast industry. For the second successive year, we've been shortlisted for Best TV and Film Podcast at the UK Independent Podcast Awards. The winner will be announced at the glittering awards ceremony, which is being held later in October. So keep your fingers crossed for us, and thank you to all our listeners for everything you've done to get us that recognition. And that's not all, oh no. We've also been featured on BBC Radio 2 recently, where I took part in their Midnight Mastermind feature and challenged the host that evening, Phil Williams, to answer 3 questions about Trumpton. If you'd like to listen, then it's on BBC Sounds on the OJ Borg Show for Friday the 20th of September 2024 on Radio 2. We're on for about 26 minutes into the show, and I've also posted a link to the audio in our blog. So after all that excitement, I thought it'd be nice to cover something a bit more, relaxing for the rest of this episode. And what could be more relaxing than a bit of art? Now, I've always fancied myself as a bit of an artist, and I do remember drawing and painting from a very early age. I also remember art being very messy as well, and perhaps that's part of the reason I enjoyed it so much. As well as doodling with a pencil or some crayons at home. If you remember, they had to be Crayola crayons to be any good, I seem to remember, or maybe that was just the TV advertising. We seemed to do lots of art at nursery school and then at primary school. Our class at primary school used to look forward eagerly to art classes, which normally took a couple of hours of an afternoon each week. Art was something different. We had to cover our desks with big plastic sheets, and we also had to wear some kind of, smock over our school clothes. I remember I used one of my father's old shirts, which not only covered me from head to below the knee, but also kept me quite warm, as it was an old flannel shirt of his, so the material was quite warm. The reason for the smocks and the plastic table covers soon became clear, as we always had paint in those huge squeezy bottles. Remember those? And within seconds of them being opened, paint of multiple colours would be sprayed across the classroom with glee by a group of excited 7-year-olds. Eventually, some of it made its way into the plastic paint palettes, which I think must have been supplied en masse to every school, and our wild daubs would take shape eventually on the paper. It was great fun, and I did really enjoy it. We also had a fantastic art teacher in primary school, Mrs. Walker, who, looking back, was pretty inspirational and helped us all develop our artistic skills, whilst also enjoying just drawing and painting for the hell of it. She also managed to get several of us included in the Kellogg's National Children's Art Exhibition of 1978, and I had 2 of my pictures included in that. I remember going to the opening of the exhibition when it came to the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, not too far from Warrington, and it was quite a thing. Unfortunately, that proved to be the peak of my career as an artist, as I soon became a bit distracted by things like sport, pop music, and girls, and not necessarily in that order. One other thing to mention about the wonderful Mrs. Walker is that her daughter, who was also at our school, was the actress Polly Walker, who I have mentioned previously on the podcast, and she must be the most famous person who ever went to our primary school, or, actually more likely, probably the only famous person who ever went there. Going back to our subject, art is a powerful thing, so it's not surprising that it featured quite a bit on children's TV. And for many of us, art and crafts on TV can only mean one thing, or one person to be more precise, and that's the great Tony Hart. That tune takes me right back to Tony Hart and Vision On. I'd like to think that most people born between about 1960 and 1980 have memories of seeing Tony Hart bring art to life on British television. The man always seemed so nice, so calm and so talented, and he effortlessly showed us how we could draw better, paint better, and make all sorts of exciting things. Tony Hart was born in Maidstone, Kent on 15th of October 1925, almost exactly 99 years before the scheduled release date of this episode of the podcast. Hart left school in 1943 and wanted to join the RAF, but as he would have been unable to fly owing to less than perfect eyesight, he followed in his father's footsteps and joined the British Indian Army instead, where he was commissioned into the Gurkhas. However, when he was told that lower-ranked British officers would be replaced by Indian officers following Indian independence, he decided to return home to the UK, and then served in the Royal Artillery until 1950. After leaving the army, Tony decided he wanted to be a professional artist, which had been his long-term ambition since childhood, and he studied at Maidstone College of Art before becoming a freelance artist. And then in 1952, a chance meeting at a party, engineered by his brother, with a BBC TV producer, led to him being engaged as resident artist on the long-forgotten TV show Saturday Special, which starred Peter Butterworth, later to become best known as an actor in the Carry On films, and his TV career developed from there. He did artwork on the shows Playbox and also Titch and Quackers with Ray Allen, before moving on to the show which most of us first remember him appearing in. Now, how many of you recognise that as the theme tune to Vision On? I could have sworn, looking back, that the gallery theme we played earlier was a theme tune to Vision On itself. But no, it was this tune, Accroche toi Caroline. Love the French accent there. And Vision On began in 1964, and it's one of those shows that almost everyone remembers, even if they hated it, as I think many people did. The show was introduced by the BBC as a replacement to an earlier programme called the rather uninspiring title For Deaf Children. As in, for deaf children, rather. You know what I mean. A programme that was paced slowly enough to enable children to read captions as subtitles. But following some BBC research, which actually found out that due to its lively and fast-moving format, Top of the Pops was very popular with deaf children, and that even the profoundly deaf could still enjoy the music's lower frequency notes. So the idea of a fast-moving, lively show which would appeal to both deaf and hearing children was developed, and Vision On was first broadcast in 1964. It was decided that since the new programme was intended primarily as entertainment rather than education, communication would be visual where possible. The amount of text would be severely limited, and except for a few repeated statements, speech would be abandoned altogether. And that was quite a leap for programme makers at that time, I think. I remember the programme's logo is made up from the handwritten words of the title, Vision On, and their reflection, and stylised into an animated character which was something like a grasshopper. Well, if you remember that, you know what I mean. The show was designed not only to entertain, but also to encourage imagination and translate that into art, which Tony Hart did brilliantly. I do remember the show from a very early age, perhaps because it communicated largely visually, and the quite serious, dark-haired female presenter, Pat Kiesel, who was quite earnest in a presentation, but also threw in some signing at key points of the show too. Being very young and not really knowing many deaf children, I think many of us found that part of things a bit silly. But only later in my childhood did I realise that it was actually such a great thing to do to include those who couldn't hear as well as we could. The show had lots of different parts to it, like the Burbles, who lived in a clock and communicated using speech bubbles, and Wilf Lund, who made an appearance as a sort of mad inventor who built amazing gadgets with lots of moving parts to do reasonably straightforward things like, well, boil an egg or something like that. We also had Sylvester McCoy, as he was then known before becoming Sylvester McCoy a few years later. And my main memories of him are chasing a sort of fluffy worm around the studio. I think my favourite part was the Professor, who was a man in a white coat who did crazy, zany things in a silent film sort of way. So think sort of Harold Lloyd, Buster Keaton, but speeded up to double time. The Professor's adventures were funny, quick-moving, and, I realise now, entirely visual, so providing lots of amusement to all of the show's audience. We were also introduced to a small stick man made of plasticine and his friends and adventures.
You all right down there?
More of Morph later. But I can't talk about Vision On without referring to what must be the most memorable part of the show, when Pat Kiesel would smile at the camera and say and sign,
"And now, the gallery."
The gallery was a chance to show off some of the pictures sent in by viewers. Some of them were pretty good too, although I do remember thinking even at a young age that some were rubbish. And of course, Pat would always sign off the gallery by speaking and signing the same information.
Thank you for sending us your pictures. I'm sorry that we can't return any to you, but we give a prize for all those we show.
Now, call me cynical, but I have never come across anyone whose pictures appeared in the gallery. If you were fortunate enough to have your artwork displayed, I'd love to hear about it. And also, I'm dying to know what the small prize was, as nobody has ever been able to tell me. Perhaps there's a bit of sour grapes, as I did send off a picture on one occasion and dutifully waited to see it displayed in the gallery. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. To be honest, it wasn't very good either, but neither were half of the ones they did show. I entered a Wild West themed picture, which I produced from using my Wild West fuzzy felt shapes as templates, which I drew around. Do you remember fuzzy felt? It was brilliant, wasn't it? On reflection, my picture gets worse the more I think about it. Never mind, my day would come eventually a few years later, with my paintings hanging in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. Vision On ran for 12 years, until it was cancelled as, after 168 shows, the producers thought the format had gone a bit stale. So soon afterwards they commissioned a new series where Tony Hart was very much in charge, and they even used the gallery music as its theme tune. Take Heart, that was a new show, was first shown in 1977, and it was just like Vision On really, but without the special provision for deaf children, and more of a focus on creating art. The show featured Tony Hart, accompanied by Morph, who played a greater and greater part in events, creating all sorts of imaginative artwork, working around the machinations of Mr. Bennett, the supposed caretaker of the art studio. And that was about it, really. What Take Heart did do was to really emphasise the creative genius of Tony Hart himself. He did really simple pieces of work by, say, creating a collage out of some bits of coloured paper, or a simple pencil sketch. But he also broke away from the Vision On approach to create larger artworks on the warehouse floor or on the big walls, similar to that other great children's TV artist from Australia, whose name we probably shouldn't mention. And Morph became a big part of the show too, big enough that he then got his own series many years later, long after Take Heart had been cancelled in the 1980s. Tony Hart left a lasting legacy for British children, and he was the first artist many of us ever encountered. I'm sure he inspired thousands, if not millions, of British children to try and use their imagination through that artwork. He was also responsible for the design of the Blue Peter ship, and also the Blue Peter badge. Now, the story goes that Tony Hart tried to negotiate a volume-related deal for the Blue Peter badge, a 1D, or old pennies, if you remember those, for every badge made. Instead, the BBC paid him a flat fee of £100, which, in the 1950s when it was commissioned, was probably quite a large amount of money, but nothing compared to the sums he might have made on a volume deal. Tony Hart died in January 2009, aged 83. He had suffered poor health for a number of years, including 2 strokes, which, tragically, had left him unable to use his hands. So his final years were without the art which he dedicated his life to. Thanks, Tony, for all you did. And do you know, he always seemed like a lovely man too, which you can't say about every television personality you see. Tony, you will forever hold a special place in my memory, and if ever I need to slow down or calm down under the pressures of life, all I need to do is to mentally visit the gallery, and this calming music helps me through. Did you like Vision On, or did you absolutely hate it? There does seem to be a bit of polarisation on that question. Do you remember Tony Hart fondly? Or did you become an artist after loving his TV shows as a child? Do let us know via the blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com or via our social media pages, or by emailing oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. Oh, and if anyone ever did get their picture displayed in the gallery, I would love to hear about it. And I'd love especially to find out what the small prize actually turned out to be. That's all we have time for this week. So join us again next week for the next edition of our 70s related TV trivia quiz, or in a fortnight for the next edition of the podcast. Until then, take care. Don't forget to like, rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you again soon for more from my 70s TV childhood.